Good to see you too.
I just saw your email. I just answered it.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah.
we can talk more. I have some ideas.
Okay, cool. I'm open to them.
Okay, perfect. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait for everyone. We'll wait a couple minutes. Is everyone doing well? Now that the world has opened up?
All's well.
I will say I went to Starbucks drive-thru today because I needed a pick-me-up. So I had the baby in the back and I'm not going to bring him in anywhere. There was a part of me that was relieved to see, I could like see just inside the Starbucks. There was a part of me that was very relieved to see that most people are still wearing their masks. I know it's a controversial subject, but most people, at least in the Tarzana Starbucks, were still wearing their masks. So we'll see. It's definitely a shift for all of us, but all of you are doing well?
Something about the parameters for wearing and not wearing and where you are and what you're doing.
I feel like the state and city were just kind of like, okay, do whatever you want, no rules. And after, a year and a half of nothing but rules, we're like, what do we do? What do we do?
But if you have 2 shots, why do you need your mask? That's my question. And I do wear it when I have to, but I take it with me. And if I'm requested to wear it, I'll wear it, but I prefer not to.
Yeah. Our lives are a little bit different because we have an 18-month at home. So like the world is open, but at the same time, we're still being very, very cautious.
I'm with an 18-month.
Yeah. So everyone else enjoy the openness of the world. I'll be locked up for another 2 years.
Are masks required tomorrow night at services?
So the overall rule is if you are unvaccinated, you need to wear a mask. If you are vaccinated, you do not need to wear a mask. And we're leaving it up to, it's a self-attestation. Well, so whatever you are comfortable with.
I went to my doctor's office today. He was wearing a mask, told me to wear one. Everybody there was wearing one.
Yeah, UCLA, I'm a UCLA patient, and they sent out an email and they said, we know what county and state are saying, but we are a place of, health, and we require masks at all times.
Doctors and dentists require it now.
Right.
And I think food service too is still required.
Which is why Starbucks people have masks on.
Yeah, but the customers did too. And I was like,
no, I mean the customers. The customers coming into a place like that are going to be wearing masks for the most part.
Yeah, we'll see. It'll be, it's only this is day 3, day 4 of like the world changing.
Yeah, 15, so it's 3 days.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens. Anyways, everything's new in this pandemic, or post-pandemic, past-demic, as someone said. Nice of you to all join this evening. This is our last class of Midrash and Merlot. And the topic that we have for tonight, we talked a little bit about her in our previous class 2 weeks ago, but that is Abraham's wife, Sarah. So for Sarah, who was the first of our 4 matriarchs, she has come to symbolize, at least for the rabbis of the Talmud, motherhood. And not just for the people of Israel, but for the whole world. There are midrashim that we're going to look at tonight that present her as a prophetess in her own right and a righteous woman whose actions are worthy of emulation. And in the rabbi's imagination, Sarah converted Gentiles. She drew them into the bosom of Judaism. We're going to read a very interesting midrash that goes a little bit deeper into that. The rabbis are lavish in their description of the beauty of Sarah, who, if we think about what age Sarah was at the time that we were introduced to her, she is definitely in her later years, but the rabbis talk about how she was one of the most beautiful women in all of the land. And in comparison to other nearby lands as well. And then the last thing we're going to talk about tonight is, of course, what we talked about 2 weeks ago, which is Sarah's status as akara, as barren, and how the rabbis did not perceive Sarah's barrenness as a punishment, but that rather her pregnancy at the age of 90 was seen as a reward for her good deeds. And then I have a little surprise at the end that I'm very excited about. We're going to, of course, look at some contemporary midrash that seeks to kind of reinterpret Sarah's story from her perspective. We, of course, have the Torah perspective and then the questions that the rabbis of the Talmud ask. And then we have a special presentation at the end of a contemporary Midrash. Any questions before we get started? I saw a couple people joined us. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so our first category for Sarah is the rabbi's imagination of her beauty. As I said earlier, Sarah was in her later years when we are first introduced to Avram and Sarai, the characters. But the rabbis are very descriptive of her beauty and that she was one of the most beautiful women in the land. But it's interesting because when we first meet the character of Sarai and Avram, who later become Sarah and Avraham, there's no mention of her beauty in the Torah. We first meet these characters in Parshat Lech Lecha, and the text says, Abraham and Nahor took to themselves wives, the name of Abram's wife being Sarai, and that of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. That's all we hear about Sarah. But later on in the Parsha, we first learn of her beauty when Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt because there is a famine in their land of Canaan. God says, leave this place, go make for me a people. And they make their way out of Canaan and into Egypt. And Abraham looks at his wife, Sarah, remarks on her beauty, and then immediately says, if anyone sees you, you're not my wife, tell them you're my sister.
My sister.
Exactly. And so the line in Torah is, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Now, the rabbis ask the question, which leads us to the Midrash, that if Abraham had been with Sarah or Avram had been with Sarai for all those years, why only now is he saying, I know what a beautiful woman you are? Why is it that only now Avram is paying attention to his wife's beauty? A natural question to ask. And so a number of different answers are offered. I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see your guys' face. And then I'm going to try, where did my text go? Hold on one second. There it is. Okay, so a number of different answers are offered. The first one from Genesis Rabbah, chapter 40, verse 4. And the explanation is this. People usually become disheveled by the rigors of a journey, while Sarah retained her beauty. According to this answer, Abraham was, of course, conscious of his wife's beauty, but now he was amazed as the fact that she was able to retain her beauty even after wandering from Canaan to Egypt in the heat of the summer. When I think about what I look like after like a 6-hour flight to New York or Boston, I can marvel at the fact that the rabbis thought that she remained as beautiful and pristine of her appearance. Another response explains that Abraham tells Sarah, and there's language in here that I don't approve of, so I give you a little bit of a warning. We passed through Aram Naharaim and Aram Nahor, and we did not find a woman as beautiful as you. Now that we are entering a place, and it says of the ugly and dark, i.e. Egypt, please say that you are my sister, which implies that throughout all of the different lands that they had traveled on their journey from Canaan all the way to Egypt, that Abraham did not see a woman that was even close to as beautiful as his 90-year-old wife, Sarah. In another part of the Talmud, BT Sanhedrin 39b, the rabbis praise Sarah's beauty, including her among the 4 most beautiful women in the world, together with Rahav, Abigail, and Esther. It says even Abishag the Shunammite was not half as beautiful as Sarah. The question is, who is Abishag? Which the answer we find in 1 Kings. So not in Torah, but in Nevi'im, the continuation, when we get to the King David narrative. This is towards the end of King David's life, when his attendants see that King David is failing in his age and his health. And so they seek out a beautiful young woman throughout all of Israel to lie with him and keep him warm. But the king in 1 Kings, King David, does not have sexual relations with Abishag. And this physical impotence is supposed to mirror kind of his political impotence towards the end of his reign. Because as we know, David was like all the way up here. And then even King David had this very depressing fall out of his leadership. So the rabbis, the Talmud say, even though in 1 Kings, we talk about how beautiful Abishag is, and we had to search all of Israel to find the hottest girl to lay with an old King David, this does not even come close to Sarah's beauty. So what do you guys think of this? They're kind of obsessed with Sarah's beauty. Go ahead, Cindy.
Well, first of all, weren't they half siblings, Abraham and Sarah?
So that's part of another midrash, is that the rabbis actually try to point out that there is a connection between the generations that were named in Lech Lecha that connect them, and that they're actually half siblings.
Okay, to the point that this probably was the first time for Abraham that her beauty would be a detriment, where he actually feared someone trying to rape her or take her because of her beauty, while it just wasn't an issue before.
Yeah, and that's definitely the reason that the rabbis and the different discussions that happen give of why, when they entered Egypt, Abraham was like, hey, you're really beautiful. If anyone asks you, you are not my wife, you're my sister. Because if you're my wife, they're going to take you away from me, and they're gonna possibly rape you. But if you're my sister, or kill him, exactly. But if you're my sister, maybe they won't do anything. That's the excuse that the rabbis give of why he says that pretend you're my sister. Oh, someone's joining us. Hold on one second.
See, Risa, I pay attention to your husband.
That was very good. But I think it's just so interesting, this obsession with beauty, that for some reason that in the rabbi's imagination, that Sarah had to be this most beautiful woman in order to be part of the mother of the nation of Israel. And I think that we've seen throughout history that there's always kind of been this obsession of beauty when it comes to like the qualities, like we have like the Madonna whore kind of balance, but that it was really important for the rabbis to imagine that Sarah was beautiful enough to be the one that was part of the birthing of the nation of Israel. So I've always found that really fascinating, that she couldn't just be this graceful older woman, that she had to be this like most beautiful woman in all of the land. And this most beautiful woman in all the land is what is part of the birth of literally a nation of people. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll be 69 Sunday, and I'm thinking, beautiful younger lady who doesn't even look 69. I love you, miss you.
Thank you. Okay, so if nobody has any comments about her beauty, we're going to move on to this idea of Sarah, which I think is most interesting. So Sarah as a prophetess. And I think a lot of times in this class, we've talked about the lack of agency and the lack of power that a lot of the women in the Torah have had. But this particular discussion is that the rabbis actually see Sarah as the one that's in charge, the one who we think of who doesn't really have any say in what happened to her. You know, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and all of us were very saddened by the fact that she didn't have as much control. But in the rabbi's imagination, it's that Sarah had all the control. Maybe not all of it, but Sarah had an equal version of the control. I think of it as, what's that great line from My Big Fat Greek Wedding, when the mom says like, the man is the head, but the woman is the neck and turns which way? This is how the rabbis kind of thought of Sarah. So they take this from a line in Proverbs, Proverbs 12:4, which we all know, which is Eshet Chayil. And it says, a capable woman or a capable wife is a crown for her husband, but an incompetent one is like rot in his bones. And they compare this to the line in Genesis 16, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, which is when Abraham is somewhat distressed by the way that his wife Sarah is acting towards Hagar, who he has impregnated, and she now has a child. And Abraham is stressing out and goes to God, what am I supposed to do? And God says to Abraham, do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that the offspring shall be continued for you. And Genesis Rabbah 47:1 says, God said, Sarah, your wife, as it is written in Proverbs, a woman of valor is a crown to her husband. So then there's a response. The next rabbi says her husband was crowned through her, but she was not crowned through her husband. Our rabbis taught that she ruled over her husband. In all places, the man gives order, but here in Genesis 21:12, it says, in all that Sarah's orders you, listen to her voice. The next response said Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, the yud that God took from Sarai, so Sarai, when written out in Hebrew, there's a yud that ends the name, was given half to Sarah and half to Avram. Therefore, they are equal. That the yud at the end of Sarai's name, when they were made Sarah and Avraham, that they're now equal. Shimon Bar Yochai said, the yud that God took from Sarai, so when Sarai, that yud was taken off and it's now Sarah, flew and posted itself on the very name of the Holy One. So when you write out God's name, Yud He Vav He, they're saying that that yud from Sarai ended up at the very beginning of God's undescribable name, and said, Master of the universe, because I am the smallest letter, you took me out of the name of Sarai the righteous. It's kind of nice, right? There's a little power in that. Okay, and then the last response says, the Holy One said, in the past, you were in the name of a woman and in the end of the name. Now I will put you in the name of a man and on the beginning of the name. I don't really like that one so much. And then the last response on this topic says, Sarai was a princess for herself, and now she becomes a princess of the whole world. So by having that yud in the name of God, that Sarai is now part of God's presence, which is everywhere in the world. So for someone who we thought didn't have a lot of powers, the rabbis really attributed a lot of power, so much that the yud in her name could end up as the very first letter of God's name.
Wow. A woman's voice.
Yeah. Any thoughts about that?
I'm going to keep singing.
Well, could it be that they were rewriting this because these responses that you just read obviously were, I don't know the time frame, but obviously they were written, way later than the Torah was. So were they rewriting it to make her the matriarch, par excellence? So
definitely the same way that Abraham becomes the patriarch, they need Sarah to stand on the same exact kind of footing. So much of like that same power that she could be included in God's name.
It's kind of unusual, isn't it?
It's very unusual because I feel like in this class has become all of the ways in which women don't have power, as exampled by most of our Torah, and how we need to rewrite it to give the women a voice. But in this example of Sarah, granted, she does not have the same voice as a man, and a lot of things are done without her say and without her control. But in the rabbi's imagination, she was kind of on equal footing with Abraham. which is something when we read the text, we don't necessarily think of until we get to the Torah portion of Chaye Sarah, which is ultimately when we find out that Sarah dies. But the Torah portion is called the life of Sarah.
Life of Sarah. We
don't have the life of Abraham. We have the life of Sarah, a standalone Torah portion that is supposed to be a reflection of after she has passed away, what is kind of the after effect of her life and her legacy.
I find this Yud discussion a little strange and a stretch, and I much prefer the addition of the hay, that they both got the same hay.
Yeah, and that's hay,
God, and God is in their name.
Exactly. And that's the other kind of midrashic discussion is, where does the hay come? Why do we all of a sudden have a name change? Is this a different character? How do I follow the story? And the explanation is that because these were the two that were chosen, that hay represents God, and God was with them.
Well, that resonates with me more than this moving the Yud around.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that they would even think that, like, oh, the Yud at the end of Sarai, that became the Yud in God's name.
Hang on, I didn't know what you wanted me to do, but I will. I have to replace myself.
No worries. Okay, so the next topic is kind of even, I think, a further demonstration of Sarah's power. And this is that the rabbis say that the home that Sarah made, Sarah's tent, was actually a model for the Mishkan, and later the ancient temple was actually the model for the dwelling place of God's presence. So in the Midrashic imagination, Sarah's tent becomes a place in which God's blessing and imminence can be experienced. And when Sarah dies, there's a temporary halting of miracles and good works that then comes back once Isaac marries Rebecca, and now it becomes Rebecca's tent. That's the model for that Mishkan. And I think this also has to do with the rabbis thinking that outside of the temple and outside of the, the ancient temple and the Mishkan, that our homes become a dwelling place of holiness. That where your home is, that you can create the presence of God. And so I think they saw that Sarah's tent and the home that she created, that was where the Shekhinah, the presence of God that kind of lives amongst us in their imagination, that became a model for it. And they take it from a line in Genesis 24:67. And granted, it's actually very funny. My husband has like a big issue with Midrash because he's like, okay, at least connect it like really well to the text. I think it's similar to like how you said, Risa, like that Yud seems like a really big stretch. And so that's always been his issue with Midrash. And it's like, it's a little bit too far of a stretch to me. And this one is definitely a stretch. So Genesis 24 says, Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, so brought Rebekah, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. So Genesis Rabbah points to this and says, all the days in which Sarah lived, there was a cloud attached to the entrance of her tent. Since she died, the cloud ceased, and when Rebekah came, the cloud returned. All the days in which Sarah lived, the doors of the entrance to her tent were open to the wind, to the ruach. And all the days in which Sarah lived, there was a blessing sent through the dough with which she baked. All the days in which Sarah lived, there was a light burning, similar to a ner tamid, from one Shabbat to the next Shabbat. And this is the text of Exodus that they're connecting this to as a model. And this is Exodus chapter 40, verse 34 through 38. And it's describing the cloud that dwelt over the tent of meeting, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of God filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of God filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such times as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of God rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. So the rabbis take what they imagine to be the characteristics of Sarah's tent, that Sarah filled her tent with light. And when Sarah died, the tent was no longer filled with light. But once Isaac brought Rebekah into the tent, that light was reinstated. And therefore, he found comfort after his mother's death. They draw this as a parallel to the Mishkan and even to the ancient temple. And there's a list of all of the parallels that they draw this to. So they imagine that the bread that Sarah baked, the dough that she rolled, was like the shoe bread or the show bread, which was the bread of presence, the 12 loaves of bread that represented the 12 tribes of Israel that were presented to the priest, a different one each Shabbat. And the priest then ate from that bread. So they say that Sarah's bread was similar to what was at the ancient temple. They say that the light that was in her tent gave way or gave inspiration to the menorah, the lights that literally led the way to the Aron HaKodesh, to the Holy of Holies.
Oh, wow.
They say that the cloud that they allude to in the Midrash about Sarah, that when she was there, there was a cloud, and once she died, the cloud departed, that it is the same as the cloud that in our Torah portion in Exodus is kind of this personification of God's presence that dwelled just outside the tent of meeting. And that cloud of presence, that like very close to us source of God, within our tradition is referred to as the Shekhinah, which can also be interpreted as the feminine aspect of God. Yes, God is non-binary. He doesn't have one or the other. But for the Kabbalistic tradition, the Shekhinah is kind of the feminine aspect of God. And that's that aspect of God that kind of dwells here on earth with us, the closest source, they say to us. So like, when we welcome the bride of Shabbat, that presence is like the Shekhinah. The fifth one they say is that linguistically, the word Mishkan, which means a dwelling place, has the same Hebrew roots as Shekhinah. And they both deal with this idea that God is close by, that it's not this like transcendent being, that there's actually a presence that's close to us. So that female presence, they tie to Sarah. And so the different midrashim that they come up with, this idea of the clouds and this light that went out, but then it's back, they're basically kind of describing that Sarah's presence is a precedent for God's presence and the relationship between Israel and God. Her tent and the home that she made becomes for them an early model for the home of the Mishkan, the traveling sanctuary to God. And then later, the bricks and mortar ancient temple where people would offer their sacrifices. So that Sarah and the home that she made and her spirituality becomes a model for what our religion would eventually become, which I think is just fascinating. That they would imagine that Sarah's presence would have that much influence.
May I ask you a question, Cantor?
Sure.
Do you believe, I believe that Sarah's presence is still with us. I think that she is, when we sing and when we worship God and we sing as a form of prayer, and that God's presence comes down and that she's with us.
Yeah, I mean, when we offer the avot ve'imahot, we definitely call upon the ancestors and the generations that came before us. And she is definitely right up there, you know, at the front of the line. First, we have to do the men and then we do the women. But still, she's up there at the front of the line as part of that generation that is a part of us, that is a part of who we are.
I mean,
go ahead, Risa.
It's bringing me back to Miriam and the well. That the well was God's presence with Miriam. It's similar language, and I'm getting the same image.
Yeah, totally. And the Midrash about Miriam's well is, as the Israelites were traveling through the desert, is that there was this kind of magical well that would appear and their thirst would be quenched. But when Miriam died, that well went away. And so they kind of come up, yes, this idea of like a well and like quenching their thirst, but like Miriam also becomes like the spiritual foundation and like the nourishment for the Israelites on their journey. Like she is what holds them together.
Right.
But yeah, it's a very similar kind of idea. Which when we read the biblical narrative and we reflect on historically what the role of women were, you know, for much of the world, it seems like we were an afterthought historically. But in this kind of midrashic understanding of the rabbis, the women, and Sarah in this case was like the spiritual driving force of the Jewish people. Abraham might be the one that talked to God and led the people. Moses might have been the one that like communicated with God. But that spiritual driving force of what kept the people going, that was Sarah, and that was Miriam.
And they sang the song of Moses.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting dynamic that, you know, we don't always think about. Obviously, you know, much of our tradition has been written and interpreted by men. But that there's this kind of recognition of the inherent, I think, spirituality and closeness to God that women embody. Which, if you think of, you know, Orthodox and Hasidic and Haredi tradition, the reason why women don't need to follow certain halakha, the kind of excuse that's often given is that that's because women are inherently more holy than men. Therefore, they don't need to do as many mitzvot. Because we have the ability to take place in the birthing process and we create life, that we are inherently closer to a source of God than men, who have to daven multiple times a day, who have to wrap tefillin, who have to constantly remind themselves that there's a certain way that we have to act. That women, we don't have to worry about that because we're inherently more holy. And that's the explanation that I've been given by many, many traditional women, is that's why they don't have to do certain mitzvot. That's why they don't have to wrap tefillin. That's why they don't have to wear talit. That's why they don't need to daven and their husbands go and daven on Friday nights. It's because they are inherently more holy and seen as more connected to God, and the men have to constantly work at it. So maybe that's part of what the rabbis were thinking, is that this light, this Shekhinah, this God's presence is just something that resided within Sarah, resided within Miriam. You know, Rebecca kind of inherits that light that then continues for many generations of the Jewish people. I just think it's a very interesting concept.
So what happened to the time connected? That women don't have to do them because they're anything that's time connected.
Yeah. But a lot of it, so it's the time connected, but it's also because they don't need to do them, because there's the time connected mitzvot.
Okay.
Well, you know, I think there's an exclusion that's inherent to, you know, the tradition in the Orthodox, and it's a nice explanation, but
it puts a nice little bow on it.
Yeah, but I think that there's a recognition of the daily grind of keeping a community together, of keeping the faith tethered to the ground, to, you know, the everyday chores that women have.
I kind of agree where Risa was going, that the women have to take care of the house and the kids, and they just didn't have time. So they came up with this reason to excuse them.
Yeah. But I guess the argument that they would make back, and this isn't my argument, but that those tasks of the household and the kids and the rearing of the next generation of Jews, that has a holiness in itself. And that's exactly what was happening in Sarah's tent. Those kinds of things. That's what's happening in Rebecca's tent, the making of dinner, in their imagination, the rolling of challah and the creation of dinners for strangers, that's where that holiness resides.
Okay.
I'm not saying I agree with it.
These are later Midrashim, right?
These are later Midrashim, yeah.
Later.
Much later.
But none of it excuses the fact that Sarah doesn't have much of a presence in the Torah.
Right.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Totally. The presence that she does is after she dies. That's when she has presence, is post-mortem.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I was saying, I also think like I'm sensing have some skepticism about the sort of Orthodox explanation for why women don't have to do a lot of mitzvot, but I do think that there is something kind of beautiful in the idea, and that you see in this passage, that holiness can be found in mundane everyday activities. Yeah. I do think there's something kind of awesome about that aspect of it.
Absolutely.
100%. That's beautiful. Okay, the last one, I'm only going to give one example because I don't want to miss out on our end, and we're running out of time. But we've often talked about Sarah, the barren woman, the Akara, and they kind of balance in these later Midrashim this barrenness, but they counteract this with like Sarah as the ultimate mother. And so in Genesis 16, we read about this 2 weeks ago. Obviously, the text says Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So we know that she was barren, and the infertility of, the matriarchs obviously troubled the rabbis, since barrenness was seen as a punishment. But these women who were the creators of our nation, literally the mothers of our nation, were obviously righteous women. Moreover, they were chosen by God to be the matriarchs of the nation. So it's incomprehensible how they could fulfill their destiny if they were not able to bear children. So they come up with a number of suggestions. Genesis Rabbah says, Sarah did not bear children to Abraham, nor was she capable of bearing to any other man. According to another view, Sarah had borne him no children, but she had been married to another, then she would have given birth. That she was seen as having like a very specific purpose in life, and her barrenness is what gave way to her purpose. There's another one that says Sarah did not bear children to Abraham because both Abraham and Sarah were infertile. They were tumim, which means they had underdeveloped genitals, and God had to create new sexual organs for them so that they could procreate. And so that becomes kind of in their imagination that the fact that they had children was like the biggest gift from God that they could have received, that God literally had to fashion new sexual organs for them so that they could fulfill the destiny of creating a new nation. Wow. Another one says that Sarah wasn't tumtumit, she wasn't without sexual organs, but she was a woman that was incapable of procreation, an Ilonit, because she lacked a womb. But God had to create a womb inside of her so that literally God had to open her womb so that she could bear children. So again, it's not that the barrenness was punishment, but that her having children was like the biggest kind of seal of approval from God. Go ahead, Cindy.
It's like hardly mentioned that after Sarah dies, and I think Abraham is 120, he remarries and has a whole new bunch of kids.
Yes.
So he wasn't really infertile.
No, he was not infertile because he does remarry. The Midrash thinks that he possibly might have remarried Hagar. He might have found her and reconnected. And they do have a whole bunch of kids. So Abraham did not suffer from male infertility, unless that other woman was, busy on her own, or perhaps maybe she had kids of her own. We don't know because it doesn't go into detail. Or
maybe he was fixed by God and it stuck.
There you go. Maybe he was fixed by God and it stuck. It just took that one time, right?
Right.
Okay. The last one that I want to get through, just because I think it's so funny. And Jennifer, I don't know why I thought of you, but I know, a recent mother of number 2. But so in Genesis 21:8, it says, the child grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. So Sarah is done breastfeeding. She can now party. She can now move around her house. She doesn't have to pump, whatever the ancient version of pumping was. And the rabbis were not just satisfied that she was able to nurse. They imagined that she was the greatest nurser on the face of the planet. So this is just too much. So Bava Metzia, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, better known as Rashi, all the nations of the world gossiped and said, did you see that old man and old woman who brought a foundling from the marketplace and claimed that he is their son? And this is not at all. They are holding a great feast so that what they say will seem to be the truth. So what did Abraham do? He went and invited all the great ones of the generation, and Sarah invited their wives. Each wife brought her baby with her, but as a test did not bring the wet nurse. A miracle was performed for Sarah. Her breasts opened up like 2 fountains, and she nursed them all. Therefore declares that Sarah would suckle children, that she nursed the children of all the women.
With her 90-year-old breasts.
With her 90-year-old breasts. It wasn't good enough that she was barren and was able to have children, but darn, she was going to be a good nurser in their imagination. Okay, one more because Okay, one more from Rashi. So the nations of the world would say it was not Sarah who gave birth to Isaac, but rather Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden, gave birth to him. What did God do? He withered up the breasts of the women of the nations of the world. Their noble woman would come and kiss the ground at Sarah's feet, and they said to her, do a good deed and nurse our children. Abraham told Sarah, Sarah, now is not the time for modesty. Sanctify God's name. Sit down in the marketplace and nurse their children. Sarah stood and revealed herself, and her 2 breasts spouted milk like 2 spouts of water. The nations of the world brought their children to Sarah for her to nurse. All those who convert in the world and all those who fear God in the world are from among those who nursed from Sarah. And Rashi connects this story to what he calls the double blessing, which in Genesis 16, it says, quote, I will bless her indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of people shall issue from her.
There's the answer to world peace.
Yeah. So Sarah nursed the whole world. She went from being barren and incapable of children to being the ultimate nursemaid for the entire world.
Look at the illustration, Cantor Peicott. We're supposed to care about the whole world and the stranger and our neighbors. And we're the example and the light of the world. We have the Torah. Look at what God's saying.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. There's a side of me that's also slightly pessimistic that they had such an issue with her infertility that it had to be made up for.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Maybe I'm being pessimistic, but that it had to be made up for. It had to be explained in some way. And so her infertility, what could be seen as a lack of her feminine qualities, that they had to go into overdrive. Any thoughts about those 2 very interesting Agadah?
Yeah, God's a woman.
It doesn't say how
you
long
asked.
she nursed all of those children. It doesn't say, it doesn't say how long she nursed all of those children. She nursed them all, but what? One time? Did she keep taking children over and over and over and over again? I mean,
it doesn't say. And this is all taken from the text that says that it says, I will bless her. And then it says, I'll bless her again. So they see that as that double blessing. So I don't know if that double blessing is literally like her, the ability to nurse, or if it's like.
We're gonna tack on to the Midrash and say that because she nursed those children, they were able to bring forth the milk from their own mothers.
Oh.
Why not?
Cindy says no. Cindy says no. Cindy, what say you?
Too much.
What'd you say?
She said
it's Midrash, not in Torah.
Oh.
Well, and that's kind of what the fascinating and sometimes upsetting thing is about Midrash. While we're able to sit here and based on like a phrase of text, create our own version of the story, we've talked about what it does is it makes us connect to the story, right? It makes us connect to the characters. When I see this Midrash about Sarah, I think of the fact that I, suffered with infertility, and by the grace of God was able to have modern medicine, was able to have a child. And there was a part of me that was like, am I going to be able to nurse if I had issues with this? And like, nursing is not an easy thing. I automatically think of my own struggles. But it's true, it doesn't stick to the text. And so if you're one of those people who's like, but the text doesn't say it, Midrash can be like a really big struggle for you. But it gives us kind of an opportunity to put our own spin, to put our own personal experiences, onto the text itself. Because Torah is meant to be like, I think, a mirror. We're supposed to see the experiences of these biblical characters as a reflection on different qualities that we have or don't have, or people that we know, and how it is that we interact in the world, how it is that we treat people. Okay, so for our end of class, we've been at the end of each one looking at a contemporary modern Midrash. And after our session 2 weeks ago, Mara emailed me with a Midrash that she wrote many years ago that I would love for her to share with us the inspiration behind it, kind of the history of either kind of the role of women that you studied like in school, and then for you to read a portion of the modern Midrash that you wrote. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Mara.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you, Cantor. And thank you for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it. So I shared with the Cantor that in working graduate school, I studied Victorian literature. And in Victorian literature, there is this obsession with women as the personification of beauty and morality and motherhood. But ostensibly that personification gave women the power to shape society, make people more moral. So the men said. But effectively, it kept them out of the public realm and at home. And that effectively disempowered them. So as I thought about that, and I thought about Sarah and Abraham, I wrote this Midrash, only part of which I'll share with you, because it's too long. But my Midrash assumes that Sarah wasn't simply Abraham's wife, but held a position of authority in ancient Ur, which is where Abraham and Sarah were, as Sarai and Avram. And it assumes that Sarah had a position of authority there as what was known as a sacred prostitute. So the Greek scholar Herodotus speaks of sacred prostitution, which he observed in the ancient city of Babylon. And he observed that it compels every woman of the land to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have intercourse with some stranger at least once in her life. Then once a woman has taken her place there, she does not go away to her home before some stranger has cast money into her lap and had intercourse with her outside the temple. It does not matter what sum the money is, the woman will never refuse, for that would be a sin, the money being by this act made sacred. So she follows the first man who casts it and rejects no one. After their intercourse, having discharged her sacred duty to the goddess, she goes away to her home. And these acts of sexual worship occurred at least as far back as 6000 BCE. And sacred prostitution was completely unlike what we think of prostitution today. The relationship between men and women in this ancient tradition was based on respect for women. In other words, she was seen as a powerful person. So taking all that into account, I wrote this Midrash, and I'll read to you 3 separate sections that illustrate what I just spoke about. So if you picture Sarah and Abraham in Ur, they've not left yet. Abraham hasn't heard God yet. So in the beginning, we identified each other by raising our eyes slightly, later our hands. I never needed to be unapproachable, and this is Sarah speaking. I never needed to be unapproachable, never demanded it. But with Abram, a stranger, it would have been death to do more. Oh, I know that my priesthood was so ridiculous, so incredible, such a poor invention. But my father had given me to them when they had asked. She is so beautiful, would be a gracious gift to the gods, they said, as they leered at me. To his credit, he hesitated, although more for fear of what they might find out about me than from loyalty. But the money and prestige were more than he could resist. Many times my God had told me to get out of this country, get away from my kindred and my father's house, unto a land I would be shown. But I suppose I enjoyed the authority priesthood gave me, the ability to issue commands that no other woman dare issue, the beautiful tunics which were so flattering to my dark skin, the lightly colored woven skull cap with gently rolled up edges that only I had the right to wear. But that was no promise, but an authority. All that was no promise, but an authority I had. But the children, oh God, the children, to be forbidden to bear them, to have them taken from you if you did, knowing that they would be left, exposed on some hillside to starve to death or freeze to death. I wish I could say that it was more than I could bear, but I had to bear it. I did bear it, did think of it. Every waking moment. I named each one, recorded each birthday, mourned each birthday since I could not know what day of death to mourn. Until more time mourning than anything else, felt I knew death more than life. When Abram first saw me, I was respected, a beautiful and desirable woman who was at the center of everything. At the camp, it was at first the same. Men flocked to worship me. However, after our marriage, wherever we went, Abram, now calling himself Abraham, was ultimately the center of every story they told. It would be Abraham's covenant, Abraham's nation. God told him, in everything that Sarah tells you, listen to her voice. He admitted that. Other men admitted that. But he was different, could not accept it, could not accept that I heard through my heart in the painful darkness, he preferring the more traditional way of hearing a God, in the moon and the stars. For I had no doubt that we heard the same God, only heard differently. And so the story became his, a covenant with only him.
Wow. I like this
Beautiful.
lady.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, darling.
You're welcome.
All kavod.
Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Risa.
So I think that's a great way for us to end our session of Midrash and Merlot, because just like all of these rabbis of our tradition who sat around and wrestled with our text and asked questions, who is this Abraham? Why did he live Ur? What was their life like before they went on their journey? That we also have the ability, and I think the responsibility as Yisrael, as people who struggle with the text, to do this for ourselves. So as you're studying Torah, if this is the first time that you've ever studied Torah, or if this is the first time that you've ever dealt with Midrash, to just know that you also have the authority to ask these questions. You don't have to take everything that you read in the Torah as face value. You don't have to necessarily listen to the rabbis of our tradition. It's always great to hear their opinions, but part of the tradition that we've inherited is that each one of us has to struggle and to engage with this text in order to make ourselves feel close to the text and close to the words of our liturgy and close to our tradition. So thank you, Mara, for being an example of that. I know that was from a past time, but it was just a great example that every single one of us is capable of asking those same questions of who these people were. What was it that inspired them? What were they afraid of? What desires did they have? That made them make the decisions that we see. Because what you see in Torah is we get a very tiny snippet. And as we know, human beings are not that simple. We're very complicated. There's a lot of layers to us. So yeah, thank you for joining this session and our little 4-part series as like an introduction to Midrash. I hope to teach classes like this more often. Especially things from the female perspective. That's kind of a passion of mine. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
That was lovely.
We love it.
That was great. Do it again.
I'll see you on the 25th, Cantor.
Yes. Oh yeah. For those of you, I mean, obviously, I'm sure many of you are going to go to the university campus for Shabbat services. They're expecting a great turnout in the sanctuary. And then next Friday, I will be with Rabbi Joel at our Glazer campus, where we have historically done a rooftop Ruach service. There's an awesome rooftop patio at the Glazer campus at the top of our parking structure with a view of the Hollywood sign like you won't believe. And we do kind of a Hollywood Bowl style, bring your dinner, bring your bottles of wine, and come together for Shabbat.
We'll see you there. I'm going to the other service Friday tomorrow. So Shabbat Shalom.
Great.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye, Risa. Okay.